All right, today we're going to talk about Appendix A. It's really easy to skip the appendices in the Common Core State Standards because they're not one of the things that we specifically think of when we think of teaching in our classroom, but they are one of the most important pieces for us to read. They are the most important, in my opinion, because they explain a lot of the thinking behind the Common Core State Standards, the research that explains it, and really explains why they exist in the first place and the importance of making this shift in our planning and our instruction. Understandably though, in the crunch to make the shift over the Common Core State Standards, it's easy to skip the appendices. So we have this activity called the Backyard Barbecue, which is a great instructional strategy to use with your students, and one we're going to use today to explore Appendix A. Appendix A covers largely text complexity, reading, writing, and language standards, and explains the reasons why the standards were written the way they were. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the Appendix A and we're going to split it up into different sections. Each person is going to read a section in its entirety, write down any key points or questions they have about that section, and then when they're done doing that, they're going to stand up and find people that read other sections, and they're going to jot down the key points or questions from other people's sections of the Appendix A, and then share those. And when you've met with every person that has every other section, then you can kind of return to your seat and reflect on what you saw and write down any major takeaways you had from that. All right?
Sure. So I took a look at the standards approach to text complexity, and my big takeaways were that the standards are really asking us to measure a text complexity using 3 different standards. One is a qualitative measure, and that's really something that it takes a human reader to assess, the levels of meaning, the structure of the text, how complex it is. So even though a text like Grapes of Wrath might have really simple language, it's actually pretty complex because of the way that it's structured and the types of symbolic meanings that are there. The second one is a quantitative measure, which is generally measured using some sort of computer program that's looking at sentence length, frequency of certain words, the difficulty of vocabulary, and oftentimes that's what school districts focus on, is that Lexile score, or whatever, that quantitative measure when choosing books. But the Common Core is really asking us to look at that in conjunction with the qualitative measure, as well as the third one, which is reader and task considerations. And that's really where the individual teachers come into play, because they know their students, they're using their own professional expertise to assess their students' level of motivation, the students' background knowledge, and those types of things. So, a student from Idaho might be able to read a really challenging text on Lewis and Clark because they already have that background knowledge, whereas a student from Minnesota might have much more difficulty approaching that type of text.
Okay. Well, I have this section on vocabulary, and the introduction talks about how differences in kids' vocabulary is a key factor in achievement disparities, which is why there's a focus on the vocabulary. It says that meaning and context stagnates grades 4 or 5, so we need to be using these 3 tiers. Well, actually, we're probably more responsible for the top 2 tiers. The first one they talk about is words that kids use in everyday speech, and then the second is general academic language, which they would most likely see in a written text as opposed to speaking. And then the third, which I think really applies to inquiry and apprenticing kids into the practice of a field of study, is domain-specific vocabulary. So it basically just kind of delineated the differences between those 3.
Okay, so I had the writing section, and there's a lot in this section. It's really pretty complex, but the first thing that it does is goes through and defines the 3 different types of writing in the Common Core State Standards: argument, informational explanatory writing, and narrative writing. And I know I'm going to have to read this again and kind of think about it more because it's complex, but basically the way that I understand it, they define argument as coming up with a reasoned, logical demonstration of your belief. And then informational writing is conveying information in some way. And it says that the big difference between the two is that argument is trying to make people believe something, and informational writing starts with an assumption of truthfulness and then just conveying that truthfulness. So that was, I think, the basic difference there. And then narrative writing conveys an experience, either real or imaginary. And then it has, and I was really happy to see this, that it talks about texts that blend types, that really skilled writers blend the three different types of writing, because that's one of my concerns was the fact that the standards separate those three types. So it acknowledges that those would be blended, and then goes into the importance of argument in the Common Core standards. It says that all three types of writing are valued, but that argument is most important. And I really liked this phrase. It said that college is a culture of argument. The university is largely an argument culture, and that students aren't really prepared to enter that culture. And then finally it goes into a definition of the difference between argument and persuasion. Essentially that persuasion employs a variety of persuasive strategies, and argument is about having a clear argument, evaluating evidence, and then considering counter-arguments. So I see that there's more objectivity maybe in argument than persuasion, considering different perspectives. So that's about it.
Cool. And I had section 6, which is the mathematics section.
Okay.
It really highlights need for greater focus and coherence in standards. The mile wide and inch deep was brought up as something that has been ineffective for us in the past. And so these standards really try to focus teachers and students on standards and really differentiating between fewer standards not necessarily meaning focused, and the difference between fewer standards and focused standards. Really a big stress on conceptual understanding of key ideas, and not that procedural knowledge is not important, but in the past we have lacked the conceptual understanding in mathematics, and really talking about the importance of bumping that up and not losing that procedural knowledge, that they're both equally important. I really liked where it said mathematical understanding and procedural skill are equally important, as opposed to doing one or the other, because I think people often have thought, well, I need to do one or the other, but it's a blending of both. Then it talks about that the standards do not define materials necessary to support students, that they're not telling you what book to use, that you have to support students where they are with materials that you find. And I really liked that because that's more real world to me.